makeup lecture will look at 17th century or Baroque Holland. We've mentioned a number of times that this is a period of war, the 17th century. In particular, the 80 Years' War in this particular region that pitted Spain against Holland and fought on the front between the Spanish Netherlands, which we've talked about as Flanders before, and the United Provinces of the Netherlands, which is Holland. This war was fought on religious lines. We see a nice painting from the National Gallery on the right depicting Spanish and Dutch warships fighting each other, but this was fought along religious lines. Spanish Flanders, the home of Rubens. Van Dyck was, in fact, itself Catholic, as was Spain, as were the Habsburgs who controlled this territory, whereas Holland was Protestant, and this was the basis of the 80 Years' War, was indeed that religious conflict. An interesting paradox is that while the 80 Years' War ruined Spain financially, decimated its finances, that same war actually led to the Dutch dominance of the high seas in an era of fantastic prosperity and expansion of trade. Holland is more prosperous during this period than any other period of its history. In fact, they still to this day refer to it as their golden age. This is the era of the Dutch East India Corporation. This is the era of the founding of New Amsterdam, what we now call New York City. This is when the Dutch are amongst the most important powers in really all of the world, certainly in the Western Hemisphere. And that prosperity led to an amazing flourishing of art production, because, of course, art tends to be produced in greater numbers when economic times are strong. It is, after all, not something that you need, but something that you want. It's a luxury item. And when there is prosperity, there is the room for purchasing art. What we'll see as we look at paintings in 17th century Holland is that this prosperity and this great interest in buying art led artists to specialize, to do particular kinds of art, to carve a niche of that market. So Cornelis Verbeek, the painter of our battle scene on the right, in fact, focused primarily on seascapes, and even more specifically on battle scenes, cornering that kind of collector. And almost all of the artists that we're going to look at in this section of the lecture are indeed specialists in primarily one kind of art, one kind of subject matter. So our first artist from the city of Haarlem is Frans Hals, and all he really did was portraiture. That was his major stock in trade. He did a few genre scenes early on, scenes of everyday life, but on the norm, his focus was on images of portraits of people. In this case, this is a group portrait of the archery guild that protected the city of Haarlem. This is the military. And every year the city would, in thanks to the guild, give them money for a feast where they would elect new leaders for the coming year, and the city would show them their great appreciation. And that's what Hall has sort of created for us here, is that feast of the archers of St. Hadrian, the protectors of the city of Haarlem. Now, we've talked about militia guilds before, archery guilds before. They had their legacy going back to groups like the crossbowmen from Leuven that Roger van der Weyden painted this deposition for. But the times have changed from the Catholic 15th century, the Catholic region of Flanders, to the more Protestant region of Holland. And instead of an altarpiece, which is what Roger van der Weyden's picture is, we have instead a group portrait. This would be hung in the meeting hall where the group would gather, whereas Roger's work was hung in the chapel where they prayed. Each of the members of the guild paid Halls a fee to be included. Now, part of the arrangement is dictated by the priority of certain members. The leaders are up front, but the rest of the placement is dedicated by how much money they paid to Frans Hals. So we have one of the leaders here wearing this beautiful orange sash. The leader of the Dutch rebellion against the Spanish was William of Orange, and orange remains to this day a very prominent and patriotic color for the Dutch. If you watch the World Cup soccer tournament, you'll notice that the Dutch wear orange, refer to themselves as the Orangemen. It goes back to William of Orange. And here we see the main leader of the guild, seated, looking directly out at us, rather regal with his hand on his hip. He is dressed in orange, another man in an orange sash off to the right. Again, reacting to our presence here. There's a vibrancy and an action and a liveliness to this work that is typically Baroque, even though this is not a religious scene. But it's activated, it's moving, it seems momentary. And that's something that we've traced through Baroque art wherever we've been. It engages with you, the viewer, it reaches out to you and asks you to participate. One of the things you might notice is that Frans Hals is very good with paint, and he leaves his brushwork unfinished. You perhaps see it best in this particular slide in the area down here in the foreground, where you can see a sort of sketchy quality, or here in the knot that binds that sash. This sort of brushwork is very similar to what we saw Velázquez doing. And Hals, too, is using it to enliven the scene and to focus your attention, to make things appear as if they're truly alive. And he's doing this, 20, 30 years before Velázquez is. We're graced at the National Gallery with quite a few pictures by Frans Hals, quite a few portraits. Here's another member of one of the Civic Guard in Haarlem. You can see again the orange sash around his breastplate, posing for us. This is Frans Hals' only solo portrait of a member of the Civic Guard. And some people suggest that it might actually be a self-portrait, because Hals himself belonged to one of these militia guilds. So our member of a Haarlem Civic Guard might actually be Frans Hals himself. Again, he's doing exclusively portraits. He's great at this lively characterization that's enhanced by the unblended and sketchy-looking brushwork that makes it appear almost as if he's had to move quickly to catch them as they're not really posing, but they're sort of caught in a moment of their life. And I think if you look at the sleeve here, or the area of the sash, or even how he handles the lace around the collar, you can see what a master he is with brushwork. I had to bring this in just simply because I like it so much. Another portrait from the National Gallery by Hals. He didn't only do portraits of the militia, he did portraits of anyone who wanted to buy portraits from him. A very well-to-do woman here, pictured seated in her chair, holding a small prayer book in her hands, and dressed in this beautiful black robe. Here we see a close-up of her hand holding that tiny portable Bible. Hard to imagine she could even read it, but you'll notice how he builds the hand with these sketchy brush strokes that still have a great sense of the structure of the anatomy. The variant of Protestantism that was practiced in Holland was called Remonstrantism, or Remonstrant Protestants. These Protestants were, in fact, very much committed to a humble way of life. Even though they're buying pictures, they really are supposed to exude humility in public. And for this reason, there were statutory laws about clothing that simply said that you couldn't have flashy clothing, and so most of the portraits we see of people are wearing simple black robes with white rough collars that we've come to associate with 17th century Holland. Even within that black, however, you can see from this detail that it still has elegance, it still has refinement, it's still a very expensive piece of embroidery and stitchery. You'll notice all the pleats, for example, on the right here, that's not cheap to do, or again, all the embroidery that you can see as I've highlighted this slide. This is a very expensive piece of clothing that shows us that she's quite well-to-do, but again, it remains restrained. It's not overly flashy. It's all black, as was prescribed by the remonstrant preachers as not being too much of a show-off. The place where they did show off are in these incredible lace collars. Again, if we think about the technology and the craftsmanship that went into making this collar, which is known for France also even painted, it's really quite fantastic. Again, Frans Hals his greatest strength as a portraitist is his ability to characterize individuals, to give it a sense of liveliness. And again, his flashing, unblended brush work is part of what brings these things to life. It gives the illusion of being painted really, really quickly, but that's only an illusion. Frans Hals took a long time on these, and then just made it look as if he painted them quickly. And I think the whole point is to have it be that much more engaging to you, the viewer, which has been a hallmark of Baroque art everywhere we've looked. Also, in your textbook and in the National Gallery is another work of art by an artist in Harlem, Judith Leister, a woman artist, which was very, very rare. Most art guilds, painters guilds, excluded women from their ranks. They also didn't have the opportunity to study in the academy in the same way that men did. This limited the number of women who could actually be trained to be artists. And so it was, in fact, quite rare to have women artists. Leister herself may have studied under Frans Hals. There's enough similarity in the way they lay paint on the canvas to suggest some connection between the two, but it's not documented, so we're not 100% sure. Leister also painted portraits like Frans Hals did, but her stock in trade as a specialist were scenes of entertainers, what we often call highlight scenes, where we have a group of professional musicians carousing and entertaining. And that's exactly what we see her in this self-portrait painting, is the kind of work that she was a specialist in. And in fact, that figure that we see, we can identify in more than one of her canvases. Here, the Merry Trio, again appealing to all of our senses, these very, very happy pictures. And it's almost as if Leister herself is enjoying them as much as she wants us to enjoy them. And so we have the smiling, probably drunken violin player, the younger man who's probably supposed to be singing, tipping his glass and can't wait to fill it again from the jug behind his hips. Behind him, a young woman who looks quite a bit like Judith Leister. She reappears in her pictures often, pointing over to the family, looking in and laughing as if to say, hey, maybe there's some responsibility out there. But it's all depicted, not, it's moralizing, but, you know, more for kind of just a chuckle. Over in the National Museum for Women in the Arts, we have another Judith Leister of these sort of merrymaking, singing groups that appeal to our different senses, not only vision, but others as well. And you can see that some of the figures reappear. So there's Leister again, holding the music book and accompanying in voice these two musicians on lute and violin. And you'll even notice that the figure on the right in red, playing the lute, seems to repeat our young man with the glass in this picture as well. So for Leister, these sorts of musical pictures are her stock in trade. This is what she specializes in, to corner again a corner of this market, this very, very strong art market in Holland in the 17th century. Now, as a self-portrait, you'll notice that she's not properly dressed for the act of painting. She's dressed as nice as she possibly can, with those gossamer thin lace sleeves, that amazing pie plate of a lace collar around her neck. There's no way that this is what you would wear to paint in. You have to imagine the oil paints that she's working in, not drying right away, and how the edge of that, if she were actually to wear it painting, would in fact scrape into that wet paint and ruin that expensive lace collar that she has. So what's the point of appearing like this? Well, it's exactly like what we saw in Velázquez, where the artist appears making art, but the act of making art is what makes the artist noble and what makes the artist honorable. This is an important and honorable profession. And the clothing is meant to show that. Even if Leicester has a sort of self-mocking grin on her face that she shares with the figure she's painted, whereas Velázquez is, of course, quite serious. Each of them is depicting themselves in a profession that makes them special, that makes them honorable, that makes them noble. This is a new conception of the artist, really, and one we see again and again in the 17th century. Another artist in Haarlem, and a specialist only in landscape painting, is Jacob van Raasdal. And here we see a distant view of the city of Haarlem. So this is the main church in Haarlem back here, and we can actually make out all of the different buildings that we see. In fact, are each identifiable. Again, this addresses the strong economy in Holland, numerous art buyers, which meant that each of our painters tended to specialize in one kind of painting. Now, in this case, landscape painting had a particular resonance for the people of Holland. Land itself was very important for Dutch identity and very important for the economy. At the same time that the Dutch were establishing their independence from Spain and the national boundary was being drawn between the Spanish Netherlands and Holland, at that exact same time the countryside was being reclaimed from the sea. And the way the Dutch did this was to put up dikes and then pump the water out from the lowlands to the other side of the dike, return the water to the sea, thus revealing this very rich subsoil that had been beneath the low-lying sea. The way they did this was through the use of windmills. Now, windmills grind grain. That's certainly an important part of their function. But the windmills we see in the background here also ran pumps that helped to move the water from the low-lying areas to the other side of the dikes that the Dutch had built during the early part of the 17th century. What we're looking at here is a view from one of these dikes out over reclaimed land. Most of the area on the outside of Haarlem was, in fact, a huge salty lake that the Dutch had drained through the course of the 17th century to give them more land that could be used for the economy. So this picture is really very, very patriotic. It's about the new country of Holland. It's about and a new country in more than one way. Politically separated from Spain, from the Spanish Netherlands, but also physically reclaimed from the sea. This is a source of great pride. Now, this newly claimed land could be put to all sorts of different uses. I've mentioned farming already. The soil itself was very, very rich. But what we see in the foreground is one of the economic staples of the region around Haarlem, which was linen, flax, again grown in this region, being converted into linen, which has been dried and bleached in these fields. And that's exactly what we see in the foreground, linen laid out to be bleached. I think in many ways this shows not only this sort of national pride in the things that are making Holland great, its strong economy, but also its industriousness. It's reclaiming land from the nature itself, putting it to their own uses, and their own inventive industriousness in the ways in which they're using that land. We have a couple of Raasdal landscapes downtown. We'll look at this one most closely. The Dutch took great amount of pride in the land, and if we read Dutch poetry from the 17th century, we find a great number of poems that talk about wandering around the dunes and the dikes and seeking God in nature, seeking sort of religious solace and greater truth by admiring admiring the nature, but also admiring those works, those industrious works of the Dutch forefathers. If we think about those poems of people going out into the landscape to find metaphors, we might expect this particular landscape to also be loaded with symbolism. In this case, all we have to do is think about the sorts of things that Van Ruysdael has included in this landscape. We have, for example, figures crossing a bridge. Just think about that for a second, figures crossing a bridge. Right? Moments of transition, the passage of life. And that's what the Dutch poetry talks about, pondering one's life as one takes a trail through the woods. The idea of change, of passage, of time elapsing is picked up by the passing clouds that we see in the background. Life can be scary. Life can be a great unknown. You'll notice as this woman, probably returning from the market with a basket on her arm, a boy in her hand, a dog looking out over the water, the path that she's on leads up the hill, and coming her direction is a dark stranger in the woods, just here. Life is full of uncertainties. Life is precarious. One needs to be diligent. One needs to be careful. This seems to be part of the message that's included, messages that are included in Van Ruysdael's landscape. Again, the idea of the passage of time is picked up on the right-hand side as water cuts through the rocks, erodes its way through, finds a passage itself. Again, impermanence of the rocks being eroded by the water, but also, again, the passage of time as the water rushes over a landscape. The fallen tree that we see here, broken off from its stump up above, right? Here's the stump, here's the branch. This is a birch tree, and the birch tree has a thin white bark that peels away almost translucently. In poetry from Holland in the 17th century, we find that the birch tree, with its paper-thin bark, is likened unto skin, seen as a metaphor for aging, the peeling bark like the dry and peeling skin of older people. So this birch tree that has been knocked down by nature, again, time passing, is also a metaphor for us all, for human life. Then we notice, as we move up the hill from where the woman is crossing the bridge, we see three trees here. And you'll notice that Van Ruysdael has gone to some lengths to make each of the three trees somewhat different. You'll notice that the one on the left here is dead. The one in the center here is broken. And the one on the right here is untouched, fully thriving and living. Certainly this is again the idea of the passing of time. It may even be a riff, if you will, a take on the idea of the three ages of man, youth, maturity, and old age. But we can also maybe even think about it as a Christian allegory, three trees on a hill, quite like three crosses perhaps on a hill, seeing God in nature, which is a common theme of Dutch poetry in the 17th century. Again, in Haarlem, which is one of the major cities in 17th century Holland, is another artist, Peter Klaas, who is a specialist in still life. All he does are these works called still life paintings. This particular still life is a subcategory of that, a still life with a skull, a reminder of death, which is called a vanitas still life. Like the trees in Van Ruysdael, it reminds us of the passing of time. It reminds us of our mortality. Right? So vanitas still lives almost always have a strong reminder of death. And in this case, the inclusion of this skull, around which are arranged all of the other objects. The rest of these objects, some of them are there to reiterate this idea of the passage of time. If you'll notice, in front of the skull, there are books, and on top of them is a notebook, but it is frayed and tattered, well used, again, over the course of time. behind the violin is an oil lamp, no longer lit, again, snuffed out. Another metaphor for time passing. That object in the lower left corner is a watch, a wind-up watch. What better metaphor for time itself, time passing. Plus gives this picture slightly more meaning by looking at we'll include the other objects here. You'll notice that one of them, leaning on that folio in the books, is a beer glass. It's been upended and it's empty, and right next to it is a walnut that's been cracked into. Certainly that beer glass is in a very precarious position, about to roll off that folio, that portfolio that we see on top of the books. This is to remind us that life can be broken. Life is, in fact, itself dangerous and precarious, and unexpected things can, in fact, happen. That idea is picked up by the ink pot and the pen in the foreground, right below the violin. The pen has been used, but the ink pot has been tipped over. Again, life is precarious. You notice that it balances right on the edge of that table as well, in a rather precarious position. Now we add to this all of these symbols of humanism and the arts. The pen is a symbol of writing, of course. The portfolio, the place where one does write, taking notes. The books below, symbols of study. The violin, of course, music, and the arts. Is this perhaps a metaphor that some things last, despite the passing of time, that the humanities, the arts have survived death itself? That's a theme we can find in quite a few pictures in the history of art. That's one possibility. Another one, alternative and not necessarily contradictory, is that these are an invitation to enjoy, to partake, to participate, but also to remember that as you do participate in the arts, participate in things that give you pleasure, eating nuts, drinking beer, to remember that death comes to us all, and we must reflect on our faith and partake in these things in a what do we want to say, mediated manner. Don't overdo it. With this in mind, we come to the last most obvious section, which is that mirrored ball on the left. Mirrors are certainly a symbol of reflection. And in this particular case, we see the artist himself busy painting the still life, his canvas on an easel, and dressed again like a gentleman, just as we saw with Judith Leister, just as we saw with Diego Velázquez. But certainly the idea of the mirror ball is that we should all think about who we are and what we're doing, and how that might relate to the passage of time and the mortality of us all. We fairly recently picked up a Peter Kloss sometime in the last decade down at the National Gallery, and here we see him doing an entirely different kind of still life, but one with a very, very similar moral allegory. This one, foodstuffs rather than humanities. And everything here is, in fact, edible. The Dutch, in fact, called these kinds of still life banquet pieces, and it makes sense. It looks like the banquet has been laid out for us, and in fact, it's a very, very fancy dinner. The pie that we see that dominates it is made from game meat, peacock meat. It's been decorated on the top with the feathers from the peacock's wings. Part of its head that you can see is adorned with a flower in its mouth. So the carcass itself is there to decorate this beautiful pie that's placed in the background and dominates the composition. There are equally fancy things all over the table. We see more game meat here. I think this is probably a different bird, given that we see its head and its wings. We see behind it what appear to be either grapes or olives. Directly behind it, we have, to the right of that, dried figs, sugar, candies, cookies. Everything is fancy and really elegant. That gold tower-like object here is filled with salt to season your meal. Directly in front of that, we see lemons on the table. Again, all of these things appealing to our sense of taste in so many different ways. One of the lemons is peeled and sort of comes out toward us. Here we see one of the seeds of the lemons there on the plate and a thin rind as well. Of course, lemons are import objects in the Low Countries, and as such are, again, a symbol of luxury, a symbol of elegance, of expense. The knife that is directly behind the lemon actually bears Peter Klaas's signature just here on the blade. And you notice that the handle of the blade is sort of extended toward you, the viewer, as if this is his invitation to you to participate, to partake in this meal that he's spread out for you here. Right? The knife that's been used to slice that lemon is in fact his own knife. He's appealing to our senses everywhere we look. In addition to the luxurious foods, we also have luxurious objects, and very beautifully painted. A glass half full, or half empty, depending on how you look at it. Probably of beer, though it could easily be white wine. That wonderful pewter jug. We've seen how good Klaas is at reflections. Here, the beer glass and the game on the plate reflected in this pewter jug. He's showing us his strength in depicting different kinds of materials, so our sense of touch, our sense of smell, our sense of taste, all of these things are incorporated into the picture. At the same time, the meal isn't entirely gobbled up. Sorry for the pun. But they haven't eaten everything. In fact, they barely touched the stuff that's on the table. Some of the nuts have been broken into, one of the lemons has been sliced, some of the bread has been eaten. But most of it is in fact left untouched. The banqueters have stopped, leaving plenty to eat. And I think that's part of the moral allegory. It is perfectly okay to partake in rather sumptuous meals like this one. But this comes with a warning. Don't overdo it. Don't eat every last drop, whatever your mother may have told you when you were growing up. Right? It's good to show some restraint. And if we think back to the Dutch and their remonstrant type of Protestantism, the idea of conspicuous consumption and overdoing it is not really part of their character. And so it's perfectly okay to show the effects of the prosperity that you're having in Holland in the 17th century, but show some restraint. Simply don't overdo it. And of course, part of this message is that life is precarious. So just to the left of our game on the plate, we see another of these precariously upended glasses rolling about the table. Potential to fall off, right? So, again, an appeal to our senses, invitation to enjoy, but a reminder to show restraint. Our last artist, and also a specialist, though in a different Dutch city, is Vermeer, a specialist in genre scenes. He specialized in these images of everyday life. Usually always interiors. There's a few outdoor scenes, but not that many. Many of his images, like this one in the National Gallery and in your textbook, focus on solitary women caught in their private moments at home. That is something he paints more often than anything else. Women alone with their thoughts. And in this particular case, we see a woman quietly thinking, introspection, as she looks down at the table and contemplates her very beautiful possessions. She's looking down at a jewelry box where we can see a gold chain, a pearl necklace, more gold and pearls on the table, but there is her open jewelry box here. And she is caught in a moment before she begins to determine the value of these things. She has a scale in her hands. And you'll notice that there's nothing in the pans of the scale. There appears to be very little there. There certainly isn't any gold or any of the pearls there yet. Those are laid out, and she's perhaps determining whether or not the scale is itself already balanced. But what she's going to start doing in any moment now is determining the value of the things that she owns, weighing each of those pearls, weighing the gold in the chain, to find out if, in fact, it's worth as much as she thinks it is. Now, this idea of weighing your valuables is a theme that we saw going back 150 years earlier with Matt Seitz's money changer and his wife, where he too is carrying a pair of scales and is determining the value of each of the coins that he's been changing, making sure no one has shaved the coins to make them worth less than they say that they're worth. With Matt Seitz's work, which appears also to be a genre scene, he talked about it as a moral allegory. Faith on the one hand, the woman being interrupted by materialism on the left, represented by the man weighing his possessions. So we have to ask ourselves, is this the same thing for Vermeer? Is she intended as a warning against materialism? Is this a good thing that she's doing, determining the value of her pearls, or is it meant to be an allegory, or perhaps a warning about putting too much stock in earthly possessions? Well, let's look at the picture a bit more deeply. Directly behind the Virgin Mary's head is a painting on the wall. It's actually a religious painting. And I don't know how well you can see this. The picture I took at the National Gallery has a shadow at the top, so it's a bit harder to see, but that's Christ up there, at the top of this, on a cloud, seated on a half rainbow underneath. And down below we see a number of human figures, some on the left moving up, some on the right moving down. This is the Last Judgment scene, and that certainly adds to the way we read the picture. Her head appears directly below Christ. In a number of Last Judgment scenes, here's one by our old friend Roger Vanderweyden, directly below the feet of Christ. In a number of Last Judgment scenes appears St. Michael, weighing the souls of the saved and the damned. Mary, the woman's head in Vermeer's painting, is exactly where St. Michael would be, holding scales to determine good versus evil. I think on a certain level, with her back turned to that picture, her attention shifting toward her material goods, she is intended as a warning to us about the dangers in putting far too much value in material goods and not enough value in the value of our soul, which will in fact be judged at the end of time. One last thing to notice here is that Vermeer has included on the wall a mirror, a symbol that she should perhaps be reflecting on her own life, on her own character, instead of focusing on the wealth of the jewels. Our last picture by Vermeer, another one from your textbook, has very, very similar lighting. You'll notice it comes in from the upper left. It's not really Caravaggio. It doesn't have that directness. It's much more diffuse than that. It doesn't seem quite as theatrical. Both of these were probably painted in the same room in Vermeer's house. If you look at the tiles on the floor, we can barely see them around the woman with the balance, but it's the same tile floor that appears in the bottom of the allegory of painting on the left. Here we see an artist at work. This is probably the room of his house where he painted. But that's not a self-portrait. If it were meant to be a self-portrait, Vermeer would have turned and faced us. He would have shown us his face. All the self-portraits that we've seen of artists have included them looking directly at us. And this one does not. He looks directly away. So he doesn't really intend this to be him per se. Right? Rather, what he is an embodiment of all artists. And the picture, instead of being a self-portrait of the artist at work, is meant to be a comment on the importance of making art, on the status of the artist. Notice again, like Velázquez, or like Judith Leister, who we saw earlier, he's wearing clothing that is utterly inappropriate to the activity at hand. Those slit sleeves and shoulders would just get gummed up with the oil paint, something no one would ever wear to make art. Now, the woman he's painting is dressed up in a costume. She's carrying a large volume of historical works. It's actually labeled on the side, and it's in fact the writings of the Greek historian Thucydides. And with the laurel wreath in her hair and the trumpet, she appears in the costume of the muse of history, whose name is Clio. And this is what the artist is painting. This adds to this overall allegory of art making being a noble profession. If we look at what Vermeer has on the canvas here, what he has his painter paint, the painter has sketched onto the canvas, and you can see the lines down below here. The artist has sketched the figure on the lowest layer of the painting. But all he has painted so far is the laurel wreath in her hair, one of her attributes. This again suggests that he's painting her as the muse of history. He is a painter inspired by history. The book adds to that. The map on the wall is about a century old. It adds to this idea of history. It's actually all of the Low Countries, so certainly national pride as well. He's dressed in clothing that's also about a century old. He too is a painter of history. This is an important part of the allegory because in painting, history painting was considered to be the most noble, the most important, because a history painter had to incorporate everything. A history painter had to paint the figure. He had to paint still life. He had to paint landscape. Plus, he had to have knowledge. And as such, Vermeer's painter is an allegory for the importance of painting, something we've seen a lot of artists work with. One last thing, you'll notice that curtain that's been pulled back that blocks about a third of the painting. That is actually a painted curtain hanging over the painting. It kind of fools your eye into thinking we're looking at something that we aren't. This all goes back to an historical legend, one that Vermeer seems to have known. It goes back to the time of Alexander the Great, 300 BC, where Alexander the Great's painter Zeuxis entered into a contest with another painter to prove who was the best, the other painter Parrhasius. Zeuxis painted some grapes, and the grapes were so realistically painted that birds came down and tried to peck them. And he began to win the prize as the painter who could fool nature itself. And then Parrhasius pointed to his picture, where there was a curtain covering the picture. And Zeuxis went over and tried to pull the curtain back. And when he did, he realized that the curtain was painted as well. So whereas Zeuxis had fooled nature, Parrhasius had fooled the artist by painting a pulled-back curtain. This is certainly what Vermeer is alluding to with this picture, that the pulled-back curtain there is a reference again to historical stories of the greatness of art and the power of the artist to control our thoughts. That's it for this part of the makeup lectures. There's one more on Rembrandt coming up. We're